Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, since 2010, the new fuel economy emission standards have saved consumers more than $63 billion at the pump, kept 540 million barrels of oil in the ground, reduced carbon pollution by 250 metric tons. Over the lifetime of the current fuel economy standards, consumers will save $1 trillion on gasoline and will keep 12 billion barrels of oil in the ground. That's the simple formula for fuel economy. You save consumers money and you save the planet at the same time. And that's why big oil is attacking these standards. The oil industry is scared to death that the billions of barrels of reserves they are currently claiming on their balance sheets to the Securities and Exchange Commission will end up as so-called stranded assets. They are scared to death that $1 trillion will stay stranded in the pockets of consumers. And that is why the Trump administration is moving to roll back these standards. There's been a lot of news recently about a rift between President Trump and the Koch brothers. President Trump and the Koch brothers might disagree these days on politics, but they are always in agreement on petroleum. And that's why this rollback of fuel economy standards is really all about petroleum. It is oil above all. According to a leaked draft of the proposed rule, the Trump rollback of fuel economy standards, the #1 option that the Trump administration is considering is freezing the standards at 2020 level, that we don't increase the fuel economy standards after 2020. Mr. Wheeler, yes or no? Do you agree that freezing the fuel economy emissions standards at 2020 levels would lead to more oil being consumed than if we kept the standards at their current trajectory?
Sir, I'm not sure on that, and I want to be on the record as saying that I have not talked to anybody in the oil industry or received any information from them about
I didn't ask you
CAFE
that question.
standard.
I asked you, would more oil be consumed if we froze the standards at 2020? That's my question. Yes or no?
I believe the analysis shows that more oil would be consumed.
That is correct. Even the
but
Trump
it also will
administration,
save 12,000 lives.
even the
and
Trump
$500 billion.
administration's draft report acknowledges we will consume 500,000 more barrels of oil per day if we freeze these standards. And by the way, by 2030, we back out under existing standards, if they continued, 2.5 million barrels of oil per day being imported into the United States from Saudi Arabia, from other OPEC countries. That's the number, 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. Yes or no, Mr. Wheeler, do you agree that freezing the standards at 2020 levels would mean consumers would pay more to fill up their gas tanks than under the current standards?
That I do not know. I know that we have $500 billion in savings to the American consumers under the proposal.
Well, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, freezing the standards would cost American drivers an additional $20 billion alone in 2025 due to higher spending on gasoline. That's money that is transferred right out of the pockets of consumers into the big oil coffers. Yes or no? Do you agree that a freeze on increasing the fuel economy standards would lead to more climate pollution than if we maintained the current standards?
I believe our data shows there would be negligible between the Obama proposal and our proposal.
Well, you're wrong. Freezing the standards would mean an additional 2.2 billion metric tons of global warming pollution by 2040, equal to 43 coal-fired power plants. There's a famous line, Mr. Wheeler, in the movie All the President's Men Follow the Money. When you look at the $1 trillion that big oil will never receive from American consumers and the 12 billion barrels of oil that they will never produce under the current standards, it becomes pretty clear why big oil would want to attack these standards. And all the auto industry has to do is sit back and drive the getaway car. So let me just ask you one final question, Mr. Wheeler. Administrator Pruitt committed to release the EPA scientific report on the carcinogen formaldehyde, but never did so. Will you commit to releasing this report?
Are you referring to the IRIS report on formaldehyde?
Yeah.
I've not been briefed specifically on the IRIS formaldehyde report, but I have sat down with our IRIS staff, and what I'm trying to do is to provide more certainty to that process, to make sure we know how how the different assessments will be used in the regulatory programs. And it's my understanding that we still have a number of steps to complete on the formaldehyde assessment.
When will you release it?
Before, well, the question that I have to our IRIS staff is what is the purpose of the assessment at this point, and whether or not the data that they've used in the assessment is still current, because I know they started that back in before 2010.
Will you commit to releasing that report?
I'm sure we will release it, but I need to make sure that the science in the report is still accurate. And what I've asked, not just for that report, but for everything that we're doing on the IRIS program, to make sure that we know the purpose of the assessment, because we have a lot of chemicals that we should and could be assessing under the IRIS program, and I want to make sure that they are being used in our regulatory process, because we have other chemicals that need to be assessed as well.
Right.
So that's one of the questions that I've asked our program staff.
Well, Pruitt committed to releasing it, and I hope that you put it at the top of your list. I expect you to. And get it released so that the public can understand what those dangers are. Thank you.
And Senator, on the different reports that you mentioned under the CAFE, we should be going out for in the Federal Register in the next day or two with the CAFE proposal, and I would hope that all those organizations will submit those reports for the record.
We're now into the second vote, and we're about halfway through it.